Well, once again, happy Mother's Day. Uh, Today, there's a lot of things, again, that pastors do on Mother's Day. Sometimes they preach at mothers, be the kind of mother you ought to be, and get pretty rough with it. And sometimes they talk about how great mothers are, and there's different directions to go. But today, as we join the rest of the country in honoring mothers, I want to just spend some time looking at a biblical mother or two. So it's not really preaching at mothers. In fact, there is a bit of a message, but it's aimed at everybody. And it really partly has to do with their motherhood, but it's more about their character, perhaps, than just their motherhood. But we're using mothers as our biblical topic today. I want to begin by reading from the book of Ruth, chapter 1. We're actually going to cover the whole book today, but I'm not going to read the whole book today. I'm going to read a lot of it. Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. And just a reminder that after settling into the promised land, before they had their first king, God kept raising up judges, which was the title they were given, to kind of serve as temporary leaders and rulers. People like Samson and Gideon and Deborah that we talked about a few weeks ago. And that kind of sets the stage for where this particular story falls. It's during that time period. Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judea. They went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And so that begins the story of Ruth. And I want to begin by sharing a little bit of word about Moab and the Moabites, because it's kind of important to the story. One of the first things that we need to understand is that Moab, named for the leader Moab, and the Moabites were not Israelites. They weren't one of the sub-tribes or half-tribes, They weren't part of the Israelites. They actually descended from Lot, who was Abraham's nephew. So the Israelites all descended from Abraham, but some of the neighbors descended from relatives of Abraham, including Lot. The thing to understand is that Lot has some difficult things in his story. You may recall that he was living in Sodom and Gomorrah, and that evil city was pronounced condemned. God was going to destroy it, and Lot had the opportunity to leave. His wife, looked back and became a pillar of salt, and so Lot was one of the only ones to escape the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, along with his 2 daughters. Well, his 2 daughters, they got to this new place where they're just kind of living alone, and they decide, there's no men around here for us to marry, but we want to have children to carry on our line and everything. What are we going to do? And they got the idea, let's get Dad drunk and then sleep with him. You can do it one night, I'll do it another night. And that's what they did. And they had children, one of whom was named Moab. So Moab was Lot's incestuous grandson. And that's where the Moabites came from. Now, as you can imagine, that made the situation ripe for prejudice. The Israelites, who were picky about, we should only marry other Israelites, didn't like the idea of marrying foreigners, and they kind of got in trouble when they did. But on top of this, they knew that the Moabites were products of this incestuous relationship with Lot, who escaped Sodom and Gomorrah, and so the Moabites were really looked down on. It was not a good place. And so there's a little bit to understand here about Naomi being loving and accepting of these Moabite women that her sons married. That says something about her character right there. She overcame the prejudice that Israel in general would have felt towards those people. Well, I want to read the next large portion of this chapter, the rest of the chapter really. And I'm not going to read the whole book, I said, but I am going to read the rest of this chapter. It tells us more about what goes on. So Ruth 1:6-22. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law, trivial side point, I would have said daughter-in-laws, but the correct way is daughters-in-law. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out toward the road, would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return to home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand is turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." In Hebrew, Naomi kind of meant pleasant, and Mara meant bitter. So she's kind of taking those nicknames. "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me, and the Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And so again, now Ruth the Moabite is living in Bethlehem with her mother-in-law Naomi. And I want to give here a word about Naomi. First of all, I already mentioned that she accepted these Moabite women as her daughter-in-laws. That was kind of sacrificing of her. It was going to hurt her reputation back home, that she would pander with them and all of those kinds of things. And then when her husband and sons died, and she got word that things were, the drought was over, they were able to harvest again in Bethlehem, she decided to go back. And it would have been helpful to her to have these daughter-in-laws with her, these daughters-in-law with her. But she tried to send them back for their own good. She knew that they wouldn't be accepted very well in Israel because they were Moabites. She knew that they would be easier to find themselves a husband if they went back to their parents, their own mother's houses. So she tried to get them to go, and she was just going to go and be a widow on her own. Again, that speaks to Naomi's character, the kind of person that she was. Well, this brings us to Ruth 2. And I just want to begin by mentioning that there are some Hebrew societal practices from that particular time period. Not necessarily, not all of them were like laws that God had given them, but there were things that they practiced. One of those was the guardian redeemer. And God had kind of set this up. I guess he did set these two particular things up. He set them up so that if you fell on hard times and you sold yourself into slavery, or you got sold into slavery, or you lost your property to somebody from another tribe, or something like that happened, some of the nearest of kin, the nearest patriarch, had the title of guardian redeemer. And it became both his responsibility and his right to kind of fix things, to redeem you. If you were a slave, it was his responsibility to buy you back and pay off your debt. And so that became an important part of the culture. Another part of the culture was the idea of gleaning. Now, of course, it was an agricultural culture. They grew fields, and they had vineyards and grain fields and all of those kinds of things. We're talking about the barley harvest here. And one of the rules was that when you had your harvester cut down the grains and gather them into sheaves and put them in piles, they were always going to drop a lot of the grain in the process. And a lot of the businessmen of the time, a lot of the landowners of the time, it was standard operating procedure to send the workers back to the field a second time to pick up all the stuff that they dropped. But God told his people, I want you to leave the stuff that you drop and give an opportunity for the poor people in the city who don't own land, who haven't been hired. They can come into your field and pick up the stuff that's been dropped, and that's kind of how they can earn their living. And so they were giving the gleanings of the field for the poor. And so in Ruth 2, we introduced to a new character, a man by the name of Boaz. And he is one of these more well-to-do landowners that has his own fields and has workers working in those fields. And that sets the stage for the story that takes place in Ruth 2. In Ruth 2, Ruth becomes one of those people who come to his fields to glean. And Boaz sees her and inquires about her. Who's this lady that's hanging out here? What's her story? And he hears the story of Ruth. She's a Moabite. She came back here with Naomi, and she's been taking care of Naomi. Naomi urged her to stay, and she wouldn't leave, and she stays with Naomi. She's been helping her. And so Boaz goes to Ruth, and tells her to stay and glean in his field. He tells her, don't go off to some other field. You stay here, and you'll be safe, and you'll find stuff. And he gives his workers special instructions. He tells her men, don't you dare hurt her in any way. Don't go after her, and treat her friendly. In fact, we find out that she was kind of not understanding the law completely, and she was gleaning too close to the sheaves. She was kind of getting too close, and he told her, let her do that. Let her glean there and help her in that kind of way. And so then Ruth goes home and shares her story with Naomi and tells Naomi what's going on. Which brings us to Ruth chapter 3, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 4. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Seems like some odd instructions. So I want to talk about the rest of Ruth 3 without reading it. First of all, the part that we read, she gets dressed up. She wants to present herself best foot forward, puts on perfume, her best clothes, not exactly work clothes, and goes down to where they're now threshing the barley that they've harvested. And she's told, when he's done with his work for the day, when he eats his dinner and drinks and lies down to go to sleep, then I want you to basically sneak up on him and carry out this weird plan. And the weird plan is, take the blanket off his feet, so uncover his feet, and then lay down at his feet and lay there, and then at some point he's going to wake up and something's going to happen and he'll tell you what to do. And so Ruth does that. She carries out this weird plan. So in looking at this, I'd love to explain it to you. And it turns out there's a lot of theories, but nobody really seems to know for sure what's going on. The theories vary wildly. Some say that she was trying to seduce him. Others say, based on what we know about her character, that can't really be it. Others say, well, she uncovered his feet because that would make him get cold and wake him up, and then he would notice her. Others say, no, that's a symbol of uncovering the feet was a sign of there's some old stories about them putting on their sandals and treading across the land, and everything they trod across was theirs, and so taking off the shoes represented safety and ownership, and so maybe that was the symbol of that. But by and large, regardless of the way it pans out, most experts say that it comes down to the idea that it was kind of almost a marriage proposal of sorts, or it was her way of saying, I'm willing to marry you. I would like to marry you. I would like for you to become my husband and take care of me and honor me, and I can help you. And so it boils down to this marriage proposal, which brings us to Ruth chapter 4. Boaz follows the protocol very cleverly and arranges to wed Ruth. So Boaz understands that there's another guardian redeemer that's a closer relative than he is. And so he calls a little city council meeting. Some of the elders of the city, they kind of meet, and he's got this other Redeemer guardian there, and he says, by the way, it's time. Elimelech died a few years ago while he was in Moab, and Naomi's back, and the truth is, like her land has been taken over. But now's the time that you can buy his land and take it over. As the guardian redeemer, it's your responsibility and it's your right and privilege. And he says, great, I'll do that. I'll buy his land and then I'll be the landowner so that it stays in the clan at least. And then Boaz says, by the way, he had a wife and she has a daughter. And so she becomes your property too. So you need to marry her if you want his land. He said, well, I can't do that. That would mess up my own descendants and heirs. And so I said, I don't want to. Boaz, you're next in line, you do it. And Boaz says, okay, I will. And so the guy, and by the way, the guy, again, we don't know what's going on in their minds. Part of their tradition was, to make a deal like that, I take off my sandal and give it to you as a sign that I'm declining to be the Redeemer. And so again, some say it kind of goes back to the idea of the shoes and treading across the land, meaning ownership and all that. And so by taking off the sandals, I kind of want to walk on this and be the secure person, all that. But who knows? But it did mean that he was giving Ruth to Boaz to do it. And so Ruth and Boaz have a child named Obed. Obed grows up and has a child named Jesse. Jesse grows up and has a child named David, whom we know as King David, who wrote the Psalms, and he was the first really good king of Israel after Saul was a failure. And so it turns out that Ruth is the great-grandma of David, and Naomi is the great-great-grandma of David. And so this story about these mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers of King David, a very important people in Israel. And by the way, it's kind of an aside, not really part of what I intended to talk about today. Repeatedly in these stories of Jesus' descendants and Jesus' ancestry and God's people, God is constantly using people who we would not have picked. Naomi was a Moabite. Ruth was a Moabite. And she becomes David's great-grandmother. You'd think that God would have had a more pure lineage. Instead, a non-Israelite child of incest becomes this ancestor. Well, a little bit of analysis of Naomi, getting more to the point that I wanted to make. Naomi repeatedly made big decisions in the interest of others. For example, her daughters-in-law, rather than in her best interest. It would have been better for her to take these girls with her to be her helpers and servants and help her in her home and all that kind of stuff. But she tells them, urges them strongly to stay put because it was better for them, not better for her. I believe that is a key characteristic of motherhood. How many times have you seen mothers making decisions based on what's best for the kids than themselves? Now we know we live in an imperfect world, and there are mothers who are not the right kind of mothers, but by and large, that's the way mothers are. They tend to put the interest of others ahead of themselves. A little bit of analysis of Ruth. She made great personal sacrifice due to her love and loyalty to Naomi. And what she was really doing is she was reciprocating Naomi putting her first. So Naomi tried to put Ruth first. Instead, Ruth put Naomi first. It would have been better for Ruth. At least it would have seemed like it was going to be better. But God was at work. Had she stayed with her own family and found a new husband back in Moab, But instead, she put Naomi first and wanted to stay with Naomi and support her. So while that is a key characteristic of motherhood, it's supposed to be a key characteristic for all of God's people, or all of Christ-like disciples. That is one of their key characteristics. Let's go to Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. Page 951 if you're using one of our worship Bibles. Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. Paul talking to the Christians in the city of Ephesus, but really talking to all Christians. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live, when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, and the Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts like the rest of us, who are by nature deserving of wrath. You know what? This is not, I'm in the wrong place. Someone should have said, Pastor, that's not it. I flipped back one page too far. I was in Ephesians 2 instead of Philippians 2. We'll try again. Philippians 2, verses 1 to 4. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, and being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. And here it comes. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. And so there on the screen we have the verse 4 of that underlined. Not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. That sounds like Naomi. That sounds like Ruth. That's the way they lived their lives. They didn't just look out for number one, which we're told to do. Look out for yourself. We're told by the Scripture, by God, and it's modeled to us, that we should be looking out for others, keeping their interests above themselves. The problem is that looking out for the interests of others can be complicated. It requires wisdom and discernment. We don't always know what's in someone else's best interest, which makes it tough, which is why we must seek wisdom and discernment. We must seek the Spirit's guidance. We need to pray about it. We need to seek God's wisdom and guidance so that we know what is the best thing to do for this person. Somebody comes asking for a handout. Is their need such that the best thing we can do is give them the handout? Or are they in a position in life where it would be better if we didn't just give them a handout and had another solution for them to work with? We need discernment. We need to ask for wisdom to understand how to look out for other people's best interests. How much should you do for your kids? How much should you make your kids do for themselves? There's a balance in there. You need to do some things for them. You need to teach them and guide, and the older they get, the less you do for them, the more you teach them to be independent. But there comes a point where sometimes you always do for them. It needs discernment. And you also need to understand, and we're not just talking like physical needs, but looking out for the interest of others also includes taking care of yourself. If you're so worn out and exhausted and your resources so used up, you can't help, so you have to look out for yourself. And that includes physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. If you're not keeping yourself up, and so we said, you look out for their interests above your own, but that doesn't mean you can ignore your own. You have to take care of yourself to some extent before you can take care of others. But it's kind of another balancing act where you need discernment. It's probably best illustrated, and I think I've told you this before, that idea of the stewardess at the beginning of your flight telling you, if you are traveling with children or seated next to someone who needs assistance, place the mask on yourself first, then offer assistance. If the cabin loses pressure and you need to get this breathing mask on, you can't be putting it on your kids and then pass out. You need to put it on yourself first so you can put it on your kids. And so that's what it's kind of supposed to be like. You're looking out for the interest of others, but not to the neglect of taking care of yourself. So the summary of my message today is be like a mom. By not looking out to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of others. Keeping in mind you have to take care of yourself. Let's pray.